back to May 20th, 1993, to the Cafe NoBar in the East Village, where the literary group known as the Unbearables gathered to prove that you do not need to be a saint or a great writer to attain literary prominence. But first, let's hear from singing Tuli.
Folks, starting tonight, we're pleased to present the first segment of a beet roast. There'll be 3 or 4 more to follow. A beet roast. No, not roast beef. A beet roast. You remember the beets, don't you? How could you forget them? They're haunting you still. Now, many of the criticisms which follow are valid. Some are not. I'm going to leave it to you to figure out which is which. And also, we're leaving it to you to figure out the answer to that priceless question: how can a person be better than his or her own times? My answer: by being admirable. And first, to get you in the mood, I'm going to do 2 songs. The first is by Ed Sanders, and this is in that old psychedelicatessen mood. It's called Crystal Liaison. Those of you at home or even in this magnificent studio can join in when you think you know the words. I don't know them. Crystal Liaison. Crystal Liaison. Crystal Liaison. In the great bowling alley of your mind, I am your pin boy, I am your pin boy, Crystal Liaison, Crystal Liaison. In giant forests of tomato juice, we ate the dope. I saw your ego float away, I was alone with you. In a great big crowd of me, Crystal Liaison, Crystal Liaison. Now we have the psychedelic wailer. Imagine Jimi Hendrix. Down, one, Crystal Liaison, Crystal Liaison. In the great bowling alley of your mind, I am your pin boy, I am your pin boy. In the great spaghetti factory in the sky, I am your fettuccine, I am your fettuccine. Crystal Liaison, Crystal Liaison. Wah, 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 wah. Crystal Liaison. Hey. Exactly. Now boy, I better do a little more jogging. That took the wind out of me. Oof. Boy, those crystal liaisons were exhausting. Now the second and last song was by the inimitable Ted Berrigan, and I think it's your archetypical Fugs song. called Doing All Right. Well, I got a hairs growing round my nose and throat. I don't ever exercise the right to vote. Oh, when you see me on the street, you yell, Jesus Christ, but I'm getting mine. I'm doing all right. Hey, I'm not ever gonna go to a Vietnam. I prefer to stay right here and screw your mom. Oh, when you see me on the street, you yell, Jesus Christ, but I'm getting mine. Hey, I'm doing all right. When I walk down the street, the people that I meet, they hold their noses and say, how are you fixed for blaze? But I just walk on by. I don't even hear them because I'm high. Gotta love one another and we gotta die. So rip your panties off and look me right in the eye. You can't miss me. I look a lot like Jesus Christ. And I'm getting mine. I'm doing all right. Well, I got a hair growing round my nose and throat. I don't ever exercise the right to vote. Oh, when you see me on the street, you yell, Jesus Christ, but I'm getting mine. I'm doing all right. I'm getting mine. I'm doing all right. Hey, baby, what you doing tonight?
Reading didn't start. One of the most
first time you meet them, like I'll give you an example. The first time I met this one guy, I said like, hi, I said, hi, I'm Mr. Ronald Kolm. So after that, but after a few times of knowing him, I started calling him Ronald. I took off the Mr. I called him Ronald Kolm. Then after a while I called him Mr. Kolm, then Ronald, then Ron, and now I just call him Burr.
No, he calls
And then by the same principle, we used to be known as the unbearable beatniks of life, but after people got to know us and we began to hate life, first of all. Because we were thrown out of the Light Cafe a few times, and then so we used to be called, for the last maybe 3 years after that, 3 years ago, we were called the Unbearable Beatniks of. And then we began to hate of. Because it's kind of a pointless word, because it shouldn't be in the language anyway. So, plus the initials of certain writers like that we don't like. So we were called the Unbearable Beatniks at the moment. Well, up till tonight we were called the Unbearable Beatniks. As we delved into what the Beatniks were all about, what crimes they committed, what infamies they were known for, especially the fact that 3 of their major members, Rollo Whitehead, Hakim Bey, and Yoko Snapple, were never even acknowledged for who they were. And we're going to expose tonight. We like to tonight get off our breasts some of the things that we don't like about the Beat generation, and we're going to change our names and prove it to you why. I want to say that the main difference between us and if you read Hakim Bey's Paz, there's a very interesting section on surrealism where he says that surrealists didn't really plan the effects they had. This was their problem, as I understand. So the beatniks, they wrote books and they go like, you can buy them, they just put them in stores. Anybody can buy a book. Now, is that the way we want to be? No, we don't want our books to sell to just anybody, right? If we ever write any. We want only a certain, we want what's called by, those of you who are familiar with George Lukash's History and Class Consciousness, they have a putative class.
That's what he did the American Graffiti, right?
Yeah, same author. He does what's called a putative consciousness. That means we're writing for a consciousness that doesn't exist. That's why we can't sell anything yet, but we don't want to unless you have that putative consciousness, you can't really buy or appreciate our works. Now, I begin with a quote that I was using last. D.H. Lawrence once said, "Freedom is a reality, but the first freedom is the freedom from lies." 1920. So now we're going to describe to you what's wrong with the Beats and why they got our goat. Okay, first. Go ahead.
We're going to start with Ginsberg's Hell, the year's 1956. This bleeding heart drivel, replete with wobbly sentiments, gave a marketing team the idea for Jell-O, which is actually an anagram of the word howl. or so the marketing team thought, the ad execs thought. So now Ron is going to discuss howl or Jell-O, whichever you prefer.
Is this a microphone?
That was right down on your knees.
Man in the Grey Flannel Beret. I got the title from Mike Golden. In the early 70s, I was a stoned-out hippie working in a bookstore on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. I had hair down to my butt, a peace sign dangling from a leather lanyard around my neck, and a dog-eared copy of Howl in my back pocket. Luckily for me, the bookstore job was pretty low-key. There weren't a lot of customers. In fact, parts of the neighborhood had been burned out and almost everybody had moved away. So there wasn't much else to do except get high. Sometimes, on really slow nights, we'd close the cash register and have poetry readings. One desultory summer evening, Allen Ginsberg and Rollo Whitehead read there together. Whitehead was fantastic. He was so good it was almost unbearable. And Ginsberg was no slouch either. After the reading, Ginsberg invited us to accompany the poets to a bar for some beers. Man, I got so excited. I was finally going to hear firsthand those rumored stories about wild fucking in freight cars, drug-crazed nights in exotic Mexican jungles, and sleazy hustling on the 40 Deuce. I lit a joint and eagerly followed the poets across the street to the center pub. But the conversation didn't go at all the way I thought it would. Ginsberg proceeded to minutely detail for our enjoyment his book and record deals, how many tenths of a cent he got for a copy of Howl sold. The only interesting moment occurred when Ginsberg interrupted himself to shout, "Who the fuck is Maynard G. Krebs, anyway?" After a couple hours of that, I got thoroughly drunk and left, bitterly disappointed. By the mid-'80s, I was working in a different bookstore on St. Mark's Place. I had a buzz cut, wore black leather jackets, and had a tattoo on my dick. Ginsberg's collected poems had just been published in an expensive hardcover edition. To tell you the truth, I didn't give a rat's ass about his work anymore, but the bookstore was doing a brisk business in the red dust-jacketed item. The first shipment rapidly sold out, so we ordered more. The store's owner gave me Ginsberg's phone number and told me to ask him to come by and sign copies of his book. Books signed by their authors usually sell faster than unsigned ones. It's a prestige thing. I said okay, and when I had a spare moment, I dialed the number. Ginsberg answered. That was my first surprise. I'd expected an answering machine or some kind of intermediary. "Hi, Mr. Ginsberg," I said. "Is there any chance you could come by the bookstore and sign copies of your new book?" "Sure," he said, "but only if you can tell me exactly how many copies have sold." "I don't know," I answered truthfully, somewhat taken aback by his request. "But you'd better find out," he snapped, "if you want to see me anytime in the near future." "Just a minute, I'll ask the boss," I said in a panic, knowing I'd be in deep shit if I fucked this up. The guy I worked for was a total anal retentive who talked a good humanistic liberal line, but was basically just another fascist beneath the bullshit. He liked to give orders, and he loved to make money, but he really got off on thinking he was respected by the local literary heavyweights. If Ginsberg didn't show up, it'd be such a blow to his ego he'd have me cleaning the toilet with a toothbrush for the rest of my shift. I put my hand over the receiver and asked the other clerks if anyone knew exactly how many copies of Ginsberg's collected works we'd already sold. Nobody had a clue. I took my hand off the receiver and said, 50. Great, he said, I'll be right over.
The year is 1957. On the Road is written. Kerouac got the idea for this one while sitting in a bathroom stall at a gas station and staring at a roll of toilet paper for 4 hours. So here we have Mike Golden to discuss On the Road.
Well, actually, Carol, it was 40 years he stared at that roll of toilet paper. Yeah, see, there are many. It's like Jack's one take. We're going to duplicate that tonight. Ron has a yellow. We're going to write the sequel to On the Road here as a unbearable corpse. Now, you may wonder, what's the difference between an unbearable corpse and an exquisite corpse? And if you don't wonder, I'll tell you anyway. An exquisite corpse you fold and pass around, everybody writes it in one take. But, like Jack, we're going to do our one take in many takes, but we're passing it around, and it will be edited, and we'll have a sequel which is called Over the Line, and this is the beginning of it. We're going to read that, and it's been passed to L.A. where David Ewan. And one other thing, you get to write about yourself in this book because we're using real names instead of Dean and Sal, and you get to write about yourself, but you're writing about yourself from a third-person point of view in first person. Because the narrator, even though I start, is totally generic. It's, well, you'll hear it. It's like, here we go. Over the Line is the title of the sequel. I've been cheating my death for about a month teaching rich kids creative writing up in Cassady's old stomping grounds in the Rockies when I first saw Max's Gap commercial on television. As unlikely as it seemed, poetry was apparently about to slice its way over the line into the polluted mainstream. I was sure that sentiment was curdling Max's gonads all the way to the bank. But if that were the case, could beer commercials for the boys be far behind? I was inspired, truly inspired for the first time in a long time. And despite jealous mumbling from the peanut gallery downtown, I wasn't alone either. As Kerouac used to say, nobody believes there's nothing to believe in. So obviously everybody believes in whatever gets them all. As far as hype goes, true, it was above the neck and rising on every front. Even in Colorado, they were buying it, despite the politically incorrect weather report to the contrary. And over in Paris, where the clouds have no sky at all, I heard Bart was still pursuing the path of the beer mystic, taking his crack at the great American novel. Well, back in New York, dementia convinced Buddy he was the one writing the big one, the cult novel of the 90s. Until the last day in his body, the original Unbearable believed the words would save him. However misguided that sentiment, he wasn't alone. Peter was running the anarchist picnic, using his show to spread what was left of the shattered word on the sandwiches. The same mob on sandwiches Matty was serving up in glops to the neoists down at the Swamp Festival. And Jim, even as he scrambled to cover his brood and nationalize the Lower East Side, was vowing to use that same word to bring a capitalism that was already on its belly to its knees. Jose, of course, knew more than a little about knees, as he duck-walked those same words from one neighborhood to another with a vague hope that Michelle Pfeiffer would finally get her shit together and be waiting for him in the next whiskey bar. But of course, all he kept finding there was Jill, who was there looking for Mel Gibson or Clint Eastwood or the not right Mr. Stud on the horizon of 200 cool cats back home singing the blues. The same blues Carl was blowing while he perfected the bad trip as an art form. An art form Michael C. and Michael R. seemed to have down pat without even trying. Though their hangovers were as different from each other as Tuesday from Sunday, they seemed like they were everywhere, drinking everything with everyone all at once in order to get the next issues of their mags out before last call. Sharon and Christian always seemed to be there at the end of the night too, moving and grooving and reading their writing, but they had stories they hadn't fully caught yet. Ron would explain them to me later, of course. Like St. Yogi the Barry was catching them all, Debbie and Chris and David and Carol and Iowa John and Claude in Japan, munching on the traffic as it came through his lunch break, passing on information about everybody to everybody else. So even if you were totally out of it, like I was most of the time, you still had an idea what everybody else was doing and writing, and sometimes, though you didn't hear about it much anymore, what they were reading. When we first started hanging out with each other at the old Tin Pan Alley, we drank and talked about books like we were having sex with them. So I confess, yeah, I fucked Jack. We all fucked Jack. And Jack fucked us back too. Though at checkout time he must have believed he was still a virgin, innocent to the end of his beginnings. We were so intimate with the work then, we talked like that about other writers. Slowly but surely, as this group of elbow benders grew and grew into a muscular mutation of itself, talk of other writers evaporated. Everyone was too busy hustling to waste time on books that weren't theirs. The city itself had been a party-hard's mirage snorting through the 80s, but after the bottom fell out, the yups took what was left of their good times and read for the country clubs. It got even bleaker than a gray flannel suit. But to be sure, in every death there's a seed of something new gurgling to be born. And while it wasn't clear what kind of baby the 90s would be yet, there was still something timeless about looking through the angst, out across the river. Maybe it was sexy, maybe it was hopeful, maybe it was something less substantial than the indelible ecstasy on the Jersey horizon that promised things would be better out west writing screenplays. But whatever it was, I couldn't buy my own carrot of the future. In fact, none of the Unbearables I hung with could buy it except David, and he had taken a vow to be pure and never write screenplays. In the 1990s, outside media hype, there was no more nostalgia to coddle to the breast, and to be honest, it had been a while since I'd even managed to raise a déjà vu from the ashes of my spent youth. So true, I won't deny I was feeling sort of responsible for convincing David to go west to write novels in Hollywood. But Neal was dead, and his Dean was dead, and Jack was dead, and if Sal Paradise was anybody's protagonist today, he'd be too stressed out to hide his obvious impotence. An impotence that wouldn't come from that 50s fear of nuclear death, or that 90s fear of contaminated sex, or that Freudian fear of what the Ma and Pa Ubu back at the ranch had laid down on him as a mere babe, but a cultural impotence. A fear that all the old jazz had been buried by the buzz of the fax machine, obliterating all the excuses why the mojo was or why the mojo wasn't working anymore. And no doubt none of us could keep up, much less live up to that heroic tradition without taking on the aura of a tragic anachronism. The culture itself had reached its peak and turned back on itself, becoming a virus infected by enantiodromia. Dyslogia had set in. It was one thing not to be able to get it up anymore, but the fact that it was genuinely easier to write a novel in one take than it was to read one was the last straw stirring the yoo-hoo. Maybe that premonition is what inspired the one-take jive years earlier on Jackie Boy's road book. But the sad part was that even if you were able to live up to that legendary but apocryphal feat for real, who but the falling tree in the forest that no one heard would read it? 2. David Ewing, which will give you a key to how you do the first-person jive. The key, David thought, was to hit the road yourself. Fuck reading about it. Fuck conjecturing about what it was all about. Narrative was just another sentimental concept, one Jack had subscribed to wholeheartedly, but that had been a different time, and now it was a used-up technique in a world where nothing was worth nothing anymore. The only way to know anything was to do it, and David had done it a lot, from the late 70s right up on through the 80s, piecing together a different route from the jigsaw puzzle of the continent every time. He'd been busted in California, worked uranium minefields in Texas, slept on New Mexico mountaintops, even seen an Old Testament plague of frogs hopping across the sky-black highway one rainy midnight in Minnesota, his front tires flattening whole amphibian families as he passed. Born and bred in Minnesota, in Manhattan, David had been thinking of going back to California ever since the first night I met him. He and I both, if truth be known, we'd sit in Milady's at the crossroads, drinking beer and eating buffalo wings, and talk about heading out to L.A., where the end of the world was sure to have its first previews before they took it on the road. In the meantime, though, I thought it'd be one hell of a place to be a novelist, all quiet and laid back if you were out of the loop, which out there meant not in the biz. And David thought I was right. He loved New York, but was getting beaten down by it, by its constant electric buzzing, the way just fighting your way through a day in the trenches felt like survival. He was scrambling to make a living as a journalist, mostly book reviews, but with an occasional glossy puff piece thrown in. And while that meant he was one of the only writers around who was still reading, in the process he'd gotten burnt. All those industrial strength jags of print consumption making him start to look at the words as a commodity. He knew about L.A., had spent a lot of time out there, and when I mentioned the tantalizing allure of Hollywood, all that easy money for writing scripts for Christ's sake, which were so much less painful than prose, he'd just shake his head with a vengeance and take another sip of beer. For David hated the biz, thought that if narrative was sentimental, then the biz was positively prehistoric, tacking happy endings onto every goddamn movie, paying no attention to anything but market surveys and the prevailing wisdom about what a story ought to be. So David was heading west to write novels, to try and transcend narrative and turn his life into myth. He wanted to push it out over the line, to take his experience and universalize it. first he had to live it, to immerse himself in the chaos and confusion that seemed to have codified themselves into a religion, to understand why nothing ever progressed anymore, anywhere anymore. Even the road, he told me when he finally got to California, had turned into some kind of soulless superhighway, a strip mall on wheels with chain stores and gas stations and trailer parks and the world's biggest ghost town, all of them utterly indistinguishable from each other, overrun with screaming kids and fat Midwestern ladies in polyester and truckers, all the truckers, hyped on speed and speeding to nowhere, everybody trying to forget about the fact that this was all there was. Yes, the road was gone, the road was used up like everything. It had slipped over the line into oblivion, into a sanitized, overbuilt Disneyland fantasy of itself. And it was only this time that David realized it, because this time he was on a one-way ticket. This time he was gone for good. Sure, he'd joke about doing his time out on the West Coast and then returning triumphantly to New York with a steamer trunk full of novels in the back seat. But we all knew that wasn't going to happen. For David had one other thing in his life that most of us didn't have. He had a wife, Ray, an actress who hated New York, who cried with relief the day they finally left, and who David loved so much he'd given up his hometown for her. And it was clear to everyone involved that they were never going to come back. His last night in New York, we'd all gone to the no-name bar in Bleecker, and he'd sat in the corner checking out the scene with a half-amused, half-intent expression, as if he were memorizing every detail of the place and all our faces, as if he'd never see us again. And when Ron handed him a black plastic Coliseum bookstore shopping bag full of stuff, leaflets and flyers, zines and small press books, David laughed and said he expected the packages to keep coming. That even out in L.A., he'd look for the postman to show up at his door with shopping bags bearing Ron's return address. For Ron was the bag man. Ron was the grease that made the whole wheel run. Without him, we would have all drifted off into our own private oblivions long ago. Even in California, David stayed in touch by way of his mailings, and closer to home, the sight of Ron, honkering down Houston Street, a shopping bag in each hand, always looking harried and a little bit late, was a vision we all kept in common, one we all held dear.
Anyhow, everyone's going to be able to participate in the continuation of On the Road. This will be passed around. Everyone can write 5 or 6 lines and then pass it on to someone else. You can sign your name after it, too. Everyone's a part of it.
Okay. Start it.
Kerouac wrote 2 books. 2 books of his came out in 1958 after he wrote them, but the next reader is going to when he wrote it. You know, we know that there was a homo-hetero triracial love spree between at this same period between Yoko Snapple, Hakim Bey, and Rollo Whitehead. Was considered the greatest amour of the beatnik period. By concealing himself in a hamper of sneaking cum-stained drawers, Jack Kerouac was able to observe and notate one of the hottest love buckets ever seen. Carefully pruning it, he turned into the novel Subterranean, which Kerouac